Welcome to the Climate Trends Podcast, a podcast where we dive deeper into expert driven insights around the rapidly evolving climate landscape, focusing on sustainability, policy, and renewable energy. In this particular episode, we are diving into understanding India's newly approved NDC 3.0. For context, nationally determined contributions or NDCs are climate action plans that each country submits under the Paris Agreement. They outline how a country plans to reduce emissions, transition its energy systems, and adapt to climate change over a given period of time. India's latest update, NDC 3.0, sets the course for the years 2031 to 2035 and comes at a time when climate ambition, energy security, and geopolitics are increasingly intertwined. So, what do these new targets really mean? How ambitious are they? And what do they signal about India's role in the global climate landscape? To unpack all of this, I am joined by Archana Chaudhary, Associate Director at Climate Trends. We welcome you, Archana. Hope you're all set.
Thanks for having me, Riddhi. Yes, let's do this.
So, I know you've been keeping track of all the updates and experts' opinions around the NDCs, and based on your understanding, I would just like to ask you, what is your overall assessment of India's newly launched NDCs, and especially given the delay in its announcement?
Thanks for that question, Riddhi. Let's step back a bit and think about the moment in which this announcement has been made, because this is where if we put things in context, then we can talk about this a little more broadly. But essentially, I've come ready with some numbers. Like, for instance, right now where we are, global military spending hit $2.72 trillion in 2024. We're in 2026 where conflicts have actually worsened. So countries are spending the most they ever have since the Cold War. We've had NATO members committing to spend 5% of GDP on defense. We've had US's Pentagon's 2026 budget, which is supposed to be to upwards of 1 trillion. US has already formally withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. And when you look across the G20 countries, climate policy is not exactly the dominating agenda right now, right? So when we look at all of this, then we see India stepping in with serious NDC. Then I think we should start with first acknowledging that it's not a small thing, because 47% emissions intensity reduction or 60% non-fossil fuel capacity addition, or a significantly expanded carbon sink target. All of these serious commitments. India has had the track record of backing up its commitments. We saw that the last intensity target, for instance, was met more than a decade early. So then this really needs to be taken into account. Having said that, were these commitments late in coming? Yes, technically they were. India was one of the last two G20 members to come up with these commitments. But given where we are, given the geopolitical noise, given the security pressures, and most importantly, the lack of climate ambition that we're seeing from most large economies in the world, it's better that they are late, but making serious commitments. And frankly, I think it's also it's a good time. It's a rather not good but powerful time, right? Because India is now one of the very few major economies that are actually actively advancing their climate policy. And that kind of shows that India is continuing with its leadership position when it comes to climate, and is one of the few countries in the world that understand actually what's at stake and what is actually priority or should be priority for a nation. So, in that sense, I think we should cut them some slack, although it would have been good to have these commitments come in earlier. I'll stop there.
Yeah, so as you mentioned about like how these commitments, even you mentioned India's commitments internationally as well, that we are one of the few countries that have released their NDCs, uh, and however we are still the ones who are the most late. So we have observed that India tends to keep its international commitments fairly measured, but while setting the domestic targets, it seems to be a different story, right? So hence, in your opinion, how does India's approach of modest global commitments but higher domestic targets affect its credibility and leadership in global climate negotiations?
On the global commitments and versus domestic delivery equation that India has, again, I I have a slightly different take in the sense that I'd like I would push back slightly because frankly India has always been conservative in what they put out. And yes, India's non-fossil fuel capacity is already more than 50%. We know that the targets that this NDC replaces technically have been surpassed or can be surpassed. But I read it slightly differently because I think that over a period, India has consistently over delivered. And given where we are, and in a moment where all the world's large emitters are actually retreating from commitments or they're not making new ones at all, then it's good that the country has been showing up and has been doing more than what it promises. And frankly, even this equity, the argument about equity has to be kept center because India has always talked about CVDRs, right? So you're given that it is responsible for 3.5% of cumulative global emissions, then the fact that the countries that industrialized on cheap coal for so many hundreds of years, they are now looking at defense spending instead of looking at climate finance. They really should not be the ones talking about a mission for India, and I don't think they are in a position to. But because scientifically also what they're doing is not exactly, even if you were to not look at the geopolitical aspects of this, scientifically also the kind of emissions that the conflicts are going to lead to. So given that, I think India has done at the moment what could be the best outcome. But having said that, I would personally would like to see India sharpen its position a little bit more because I think not because of anything else, but because there has to be a clearer long-term trajectory. Because if we're seeing the risks, then we're seeing those risks stack up much faster, much bigger. So I think we need to, for our own sake, look at what we can do by 2035, but also what we have to do after that. And so that is a conversation that we need to have internally, and we need to be able to do something about it on our own terms and move on it for our own sake. So that's how I see this.
And like as you actively talked about risks in the end, I would move on to the next question and ask you that, especially given the recent fuel disruptions because of the geopolitical conflicts going on in West Asia and the consequential supply chain blockages, does NDC 3.0 signal a shift in India's climate policy towards energy security?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think this is the most underappreciated dimension of our NDC 3.0 because this is probably where commitments should ideally stick, right? Because India imports around 85% of our crude oil. And we have watched fossil fuel price shocks hit inflation. They put pressure on our current account. They really affect household spending and energy use. It has in India has watched very carefully what has also happened to the European economies when energy dependence became a geopolitical after 2022 when the war began in Ukraine. So Europe is now spending hugely on defense, partly because of its energy vulnerability. And that is what contributed to the security crisis. So I think India has kind of looked at that and has taken its lesson from there. So the green hydrogen mission, the domestic clean manufacturing incentives, the nuclear push, the rooftop solar, all of that, when you see it, then you know that this is a lot about energy sovereignty and not just about climate. And clean transition is, I think, naturally being framed internally as as a strategic insurance. And so this framing is what makes it actually work, in my view. I think that there is a consistency across. I think that when we look at how governments across the world are looking at this, I think this secure energy security aspect of the NDC, I think, has buy-in across the government in India because I think that's also how we've seen the industry in a way look at energy security issues like green hydrogen, where things are going. The conversations, at least, even though the investments are yet to come in, I think that there is a buy-in. And it's kind of a good alignment of interests when you see that in the NTCs, is what I would say.
Thanks, Archana. And talking about like how you said that it's a strategic move, and like there are talks about energy sovereignty, like as an evidence of the like how the NDCs have been launched recently. So I just would like to move and talk about the targets that have been mentioned in there. So what do you think about like specifically about the emission intensity targets? Are emissions intensity targets enough for long term climate action, or should India move towards absolute emission reductions?
Absolute emissions reductions is something that we saw, for instance, China do this. But if you look at India's position consistently over the last 3 decades, almost 2.5 decades of climate conversations at the UNFCCC, we have always talked about CBDR. So, in my opinion, my view, the straight answer I would give is that intensity targets are the right metric for India, right? And I think that the pressure to move to absolute reductions, it kind of undermines this equity argument, at least in the current moment, where we are economically, where and what our trajectory is. Because although the critics are right about the fact that intensity, CO2 per unit of GDP, that can fall, while absolute emissions rise if the economy is growing fast enough. And the Indian economy is growing fast. So the 1.5-degree pathway ultimately requires absolute emissions to fall globally. But what people really don't weigh right about India is that the overall contributions of historic emissions is 3.5%. And the country is demanding absolute reduction targets from India are in several cases we've seen they are also simultaneously expanding their defense budgets by double digits. There is cutting down of development and climate finance. So the credibility of those demands, let's say, is limited. What I think India should begin developing for its own strategic interests is a clear idea around when its emissions will peak. So once we have that, not get into hard legal commitments, but to actually at least give a direction of travel and say, okay, this is where our emissions will peak and this is how our trajectory will be. Because we are kind of well placed to make that case on our own terms with our own data before COP, we looked at this even before COP 30. So I think having this kind of a trajectory clarity is probably more powerful than kind of talking about emissions intensity versus absolute emissions.
So, talking about clarity and how you feel that India has like absolute clarity of what they need to be doing in the future, I just want to take you towards like India being the BRICS 2026 president, like taking forward the BRICS 2026 presidency of the year. So, how do you think that India can use its BRICS 2026 presidency to turn these commitments into real progress on green finance and clean energy cooperation?
That's a good question. India, given that India is the BRICS chair this year, I think that the announcement of the NDC 3.0 gave it a kind of a moral authority on climate. It's That is why I said when we began the conversation that the timing is very interesting of making this announcement, because this combination of being able to say, okay, this is where we are at on climate policy, and this is how serious we are on this. A lot at a time when you are holding a leadership position like a BRICS chair, it is also a kind of interesting signal. And given that when you look at the BRICS grouping itself, this is 40% of global emissions. These are all countries that are, navigating the same basic tension that India is navigating. So development needs, climate pressures, frustration with climate finance architecture. So, whether it's China, Brazil, South Africa, India, there's a lot of common ground on this than they are given credit for a lot of times. And frankly, there are things that India can push. We saw Indian diplomacy at work during the G20 presidency. And we saw that India was able to bring all countries to an agreement on one of the most difficult ideas in climate finance, which is that climate required trillions, not billions. And it was in India. under India's G20 presidency that we actually were able to say, okay, $1 trillion is required, and all countries agreed and they signed up for it. Similarly, if India can push for things concretely, ideally, uh, it would be really good to see a serious operationalization of a BRICS green finance mechanism. The new development bank, which was built for this purpose, hasn't really, you know, seen this kind of ambition that the moment requires, and that's something that if we can see this year, it'll be great. Secondly, a coordinated position on the NCQG, or the new global climate finance goal, which, we've already made certain commitments. These economies can collectively leverage their weight, and they can insist on, you know, money flows into climate, global money flows coming into climate, a restructuring of the architecture that is required to make those money flows available for climate. And finally, the clean energy supply chain dialogue. I think, given the importance that China holds as in manufacturing and India's industrial ambitions, it will be a complementarity under a BRICS framework. The countries could talk about this kind of a supply chain dialogue, not just China, but also Brazil, also South Africa, India, other partners. It would be an interesting and genuinely transformative actually move if that were to happen. I think with NDC 3.0, India has kind of shown that it is one of the very few large economies that still have and are willing to move on climate ambition at a time when the world is kind of retreating. And that's not something, that I think that is something that credential, I think we will see worked into the BRICS leadership this year. At least I hope it will be. And it's a strong hand to play. And I think it would be wonderful to see India play that hand, basically. And I think India remains a very, very serious actor in a very difficult time globally. And I think that it would be worth watching how the BRICS presidency, outcomes play out in such a difficult year. But the NDC 3.0 kind of gives some hope. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Archana. And on that hopeful note of India being able to address that climate requires trillions, not billions, as you said, and hoping for a new and restructured architecture of green finance mechanism, as you mentioned, under BRICS, I feel that this brings us to the end of our conversation. Thank you so much, Archana, for joining us and sharing such valuable insights on India's NDC 3.0 and what it means in the moment of shifting climate and energy priorities. It is clear that India's updated commitments raise as many important questions as they answer, from implementation and sectoral pathways to the country's role as a global South leader in climate action. Thank you for listening to the Climate Trends podcast. Stay tuned for more conversations on climate, energy, and the policy shifts shaping our future.